Welcome to Great Decisions today. Our topic is Myanmar. Our speaker is Professor Robert Sturken from UT Tyler. Before we begin and before I introduce him, I would be remiss not to mention that this Great Decisions lecture series is sponsored by the American Association of University Women of Tyler, the League of Women Voters of Tyler-Smith County, the Tyler Public Library, where we are and have been, and the Foreign Policy Association, which comes up with our topics every year. Robert Sturken, our speaker today, is a professor of political science at UT Tyler. He is the author of many articles, chapters, and books, including Bill Ratliff, A Profile in Courage and Leadership in American Politics, and Teaching Barefoot in Burma. Sturken is currently writing a book about religion and politics in Southeast Asia, which I'm sure he'll be happy to talk about during the question and answer period. He was a senior Fulbright scholar at Yangon University in Burma/Myanmar in 2015 to 2016, and also in China at Jilin University in 2018. At the University of Texas at Tyler, Sturken regularly teaches courses in Texas politics, religion and politics, international relations, and Asian politics. And he is an expert on, distinguished expert on this very topic. So I really could not think of a better speaker, here or in East Texas, or for that matter in the country, to present today. So as they used to say in the 1970s, when they would introduce the rock band Kiss at concerts, you wanted the best, you got the best. So I think you can trust our
resume. I don't know, it's a little self-aggrandizing. Dr. Crane, thank you for doing all of this. I mean, for making this all happen. Let's give him a round of applause. It's a lot of work, and we're grateful that you've done it. I was thinking on the way over here, I think this is my 26th time to do this with you guys, and some of you have been with me almost that entire time. Some years I did 2 or 3, and some years I missed. So I started in 2000 when Tom came to my office and asked me if I would come and do one. So what's that?
Tom Tucker.
Tom Tucker. Remind me of his wife's name.
Jen.
Jen, yeah. And why I kept in trouble with that. But Tom came and drugged me to do that. I think at that first time I did 2 of them. So anyway, lovely man, lovely. It's good, I think, to get to be with you guys year in, year out. It's always good to come and to talk to you. I want to start today with a question. I want you to, if you're taking notes, or if you got a device that you can type on something, maybe write this question down. And I want you to hold the question with me as I go through the story that I'm going to tell you today. So write the question down and hold the question, maybe refer back to the question and the way that you think about the question as I'm going through the story that I'm going to tell. So the question that I want to ask you, I want you to think about is how should we be governed? How should we be governed? It's interesting, I think, to think that that's a question that needs to be discussed, or it's a question that we humans need to think about. The how should we be governed question presupposes that, what does it presuppose? It presupposes that we need governing, doesn't it? Isn't it interesting to think about it from that point of view? For my career now, I have been telling students that humans have come up with basically 3 ways to be governed. And I have defaulted to this idea that the democracy way is the best way. Because I kind of agree with Winston Churchill. What did Churchill say about that? That a democracy is the worst form of government.
Except
except for all the others. I think Churchill was absolutely right about that. I mean, there's other forms of government, 2 or 3, you know, dictatorships, central forms of government, that sort of thing. But other than those 2, this is what we've come up with. And I brought a book in that I just wanted to footnote here. I'm not going to spend time on this today. For those of you who are up for a real challenge, this book, The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity, challenges some of the very basic assumptions that I'm asking you to think about now. Some of those very basic assumptions about the need for government, how we're governed, those kinds of questions. These are archaeologists, anthropologists addressing this question from ancient history point of view. I'm not going to get into it today because it's a whole other story, and it's actually 1,000 pages worth of archaeology and anthropology, and that's for another time. But I want you to think about this idea of democracy and the importance of it as we think about Myanmar. Now, Myanmar is a place, as those who know me, is near and dear to my heart. And so I'm going to try to do this without being emotional. But it's hard because I'm intimately connected and daily connected with people there. I know people, and I'm like constantly in touch with them. So they've got a new encrypted app for text messaging. It's called Signal. Is anybody on Signal? And Signal, it doesn't allow the government to get to the Myanmar government to get to the messaging like they could when they get off their messaging on Facebook. And so I'm regularly in contact with my friends and my colleagues and all that sort of thing in Myanmar, which is interesting because the world has kind of changed and technology has allowed us to have this intimate relationship. All right, so how should we be governed? I want you to be thinking about that. And the story I'm going to tell you is about that question in Myanmar. And then I'm going to finish the story with where we are today and where I think we might go. And then I'll kind of take some questions from you and raise my interest. So is it Burma or Myanmar? That was asked in this room. Do you guys remember that? Mm-hmm. That was asked in this room, so I thought I'd start with the answer again. It's an interesting question. Is it Burma or Myanmar? And I wrote the answer out for you here. For centuries, Myanmar's kings called themselves Myanmar kings. Myanmar kings. And over time, that sounded, the way they say it, tonally, it sounded like Burma to the Europeans when they first got there. And when I was doing my research for my current book, I found Burma spelled in a lot of different ways by early Europeans who were visiting the place. And the British in particular were headed all over the place. So they started calling it Burma or Burma based upon what they were hearing. And then during the colonial times, during the British years there, they adopted that name as the name of the country. The odd thing about it is that when they changed it back in 1989, the military changed it back to Myanmar, it didn't really change anything within the country. They were already all calling it that anyway, within their language. So nothing really changed. It only changes, and the only questions to debate is those of us who are foreigners looking in. Does that make sense? So is it Myanmar or Burma? It's actually the same, and it doesn't really matter what you call it. So I call it Myanmar because that's what the people who are there call it. So let's talk about governing in Myanmar. I'm going to go through this really quickly because there's a lot of history here and there's a lot of things that are worth thinking about. And mostly I'm just going to show you nice pictures and let you think about the story a little bit. From 1054, when the founding king takes over Myanmar, till when the British arrive in the 1820s, 1824, Myanmar is ruled by kings. In an authoritarian king way, complete authority with the kings. Interesting relationship for another time, and maybe we'll ask a question about it later, about the relationship between Buddhism and these kings is worth thinking about. But there was a strong relationship between the two. What you see there in the left picture is a current, actually from like last year, a photograph of Naypyidaw, which is the capital of Myanmar now. And the military has erected these monuments over the parade ground to these early Myanmar kings. And what you're looking at there are massive statues. You can see that they're in relative time that they're really, really tall. The military absolutely reveres these kings and the kings and that particular type of rule. The military leaders, the guys who are in charge, think of themselves as, and have thought of themselves as Myanmar's kings. Kind of an interesting little twist on the way they think about that. Okay, so from 1054 to 1824, king rule. Okay? A lot of people think the Myanmar people don't know about anything other than that. Because that's a long time to be ruled just by kings. Interesting idea, interesting way of thinking about it. It's almost as if they're stuck in one particular time. From 1824 to 1948, the British, with a little fragment of the Japanese, ruled there, as a colonial rule. The British did some really interesting things while they were there. As you know, the British did in lots of places around the world, us included. Yeah, thank you, Jenny. The British built Yangon University, or Rangoon University, there in Yangon. And at that university, it looks, and it's still there, by the way, it still is as they built it. It looks like Cambridge. It's the same exact architecture. And it's not kept up the way Cambridge is, but it's exactly the same architecture. Same arches, same type of building. And you can see that colonial buildings are still standing all throughout Yangon, all throughout the country. The British built them based upon what their own architecture was, and it's all still really beautiful stuff. At Yangon University, they moved Cambridge and Oxford, primarily, other than King's College, also professors into that university. So while they're running the country, they take British professors and they put them in the universities, Yangon Rangoon University in particular. And this is important for later. So they put these up, the British, some of these are really renowned historians and political science professors and that sort of thing. I mean, and today they're storied, and if you're interested, you can look them up. They're a really interesting group of men. Almost all of them, I guess. And these British professors taught John Locke, as you would expect them to do. And they did these Rousseau, Lockean, Milton type ideas. And they taught this to a group of men who came of age in the 1930s, 1920s, 1930s. And this group of men went on to govern and to teach and to be part of every important decision that was made in Myanmar from that point forward. Aung San Suu Kyi's father was one of them, who was taught by these British professors. And so you've got this Lockean liberal notion of the world, democracy, being taught in this university. Interestingly enough, that was kind of the undoing of the British. They undid themselves with their own liberal thought, with their own liberal teaching. And people thought, well, wait a minute, we need a democracy too. And here you are as ruling us from India, and that's what they were doing. We need one, and they actually used these liberal ideas that came from these British professors to overthrow or to call for an overthrow of the British government. And they successfully did so, and finally in 1948 the British leave. From 1948 to 1962,
Myanmar had a democracy. What you're looking at there is U Nu. Does anybody remember that person? Remember?
Yeah.
Somebody. Yeah. When I was going to Myanmar, somebody in Great Decisions, this group had served there during World War II and was sitting in this particular group. And he reached out to me. This is a funny story. I can't believe I'm telling you this. The person from Great Decisions in this room reached out to me to take back a Buddha that he had stolen while he was there as a soldier. All these years he had kept it and it weighed upon him that he'd kept this particular Buddha. It's okay, brother. It's okay. You can keep the Buddha. I think you'll be okay. Anyway, so you knew we're not talking ancient history anymore. Is what I'm trying to say. We're talking the 1950s, and Yu was elected. NU is his name. U is the like the Mister, and NU was his name. So it's Yu. It's called this. And Nu ran the country in a really odd way. He was one of these students of the British professors at Yangon University, by the way. And he ran the country in a really interestingly, it was pro-democracy, pro-United States, very close with American presidents, spent a lot of time in the United States, and came here after his service as well. He spent time at the universities here teaching. In the new period, there is a fairly robust and widespread acceptance of democracy. The people of Myanmar voted on their leaders, they voted on policies, and they engaged in their democracy over and over. In 1962, to cut the story shorter and save on time here, in 1962, March of 62, General Ne Win takes over in a coup. And Ne Win ousted Yu Nu, who came to the United States and then went back, and it's a whole story for another time. And from 1962 to 1988, General Ne Win ruled the country with an iron fist. And he took over as an authoritarian dictator. And he ruled the country from this really draconian, authoritarian way. Does that make sense? Am I going to get that across? So you've got a period of democracy from 1948 to 1962. And I can go into the details of why there was a coup, but that's for another time. So there's a coup in 1962. The military takes over. General Ne Win takes over in 1962, and he runs the country in a brutal, really horrible way. It's horrible if you're one of the people on the outside. From 1962 to 1988, there are 4 episodes of, and I call them episodes, I'm not really sure if that's the correct word, but 4 episodes of pro-democracy movements that happened from 1960s through to today. I want you to think about this for a second. The Myanmar people are thinking about how they want to be governed. Is essentially what it is. They're thinking about how they want to be governed. And at different times in their history, and we'll talk about what those times are in just a second. At different times in their history, they have literally revolted. And they've taken to the streets and moved to try to overthrow the authoritarian government that is repressive over their regime. Does that make sense? You guys follow me? The first episode occurred in 1974. And I want to know if this crowd knows this man. Do you guys know Youth Ed? Good, I thought you might. Okay, my students are like, that's ancient history. There's no way I'm doing that.
They weren't born.
They weren't born yet. They weren't even considered yet at that point, were they? So U Thant is the Secretary of the Secretary General of the United Nations. In 1974, he passes away. He's revered in Myanmar. Still today is, by the way. There's his house, and there's a museum, and you can go to it and visit, and you should when the coup's gone, when the military's gone. When Myanmar, when Thant passes, General Ne Win does not respect or like Thant because of what he represents. Thant represents Buddhism, peace. Buddhism is a whole other subject. Peace. Liberal ideas from about freedom and democracy, and he's been promoting that sort of thing for a decade in the United Nations, in Washington, in New York, and elsewhere. When he passes, Ne Win decides to be disrespectful to his family about his funeral on purpose. Decides that he's not going to give him any honors in the country. This goes over really badly with the Myanmar people. They really took offense to the snub of somebody that the people really revere. It's cool when one of your own goes to the world stage and is so revered on the world stage. If you guys remember back about this time, he was really well thought of as a world leader. He's a kind, gentle person who's interested in helping and making things better in the world. And a lot of world leaders liked him on both sides of whatever the equation that you look at. So anyway, the Myanmar people revolted in 1974. This is the first of the 4 episodes. They revolt in a major way. Hundreds of thousands of people crowd into the streets. They marched. They actually stole U Thant's body from a mosque and that sort of thing. It's a whole long and complicated story. But this is the first of these major uprisings against the military. All because of U Thant. Ne Win comes down hard on the protesters. Hard is kind of an understatement. There are thousands of them killed. There are tens of thousands of them put in insane prison in Yangon. Social scientists ask, where did the revolution go? A lot. Where did the revolution go? I argue that the revolution did not go anywhere. It was just repressed with bullets and prison. Does that make sense? It's still there. The desire for the democracy is still part of what the people want. In 1988, another event occurs. This time it's an economic crisis that pushes the people to try to once again to overthrow the democracy and to push for change. Hundreds of thousands of people came out in what's called the 4/8 uprising, or the 8/88 uprising. It was in August of 1988. In the 8/88 uprising, all of Myanmar, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people crowd into the streets, and that generation once again fought for democracy. I interviewed a lot of people when I was in Myanmar who were part of the 88 uprising. A lot of them spent a lot of time in prison. They spent time in prison from 1988 until when I got there in 2015. They were in prison. A lot of them, interestingly enough, were studying while they were in prison. Interesting ideas. And studying political science and history and studying how to rule themselves. I think that's fascinating. I think that's just really fascinating. There were men and women who were thinking about how to govern themselves while they're in insane prison in Yangon. The 88 uprising, and the men of the 88 uprising and women of the 88 uprising are now my age, and they're late 50s, early 60s, and they are largely make up the National League for Democracy or party members now. Does that make sense? So the 88 all the people who spent all that time in prison, the ones that weren't killed obviously, and all the time in prison, are now the active leaders for the National League for Democracy. So in 88, Aung San Suu Kyi comes on the scene as well. So Aung San Suu Kyi goes back to see her mother, interestingly enough, coincidentally enough, it's a whole story for another time, and she is drawn into, because of her name, because of her connection to her father, who was educated by the British professors I told you about. She is drawn into leadership at that point, and becomes an icon for democracy. And I want to footnote that for a second. This icon for democracy, and the military then and now think about her as democracy. They think about her as like the personification of it. And there might be a problem with that thinking. I'll talk about why. They suppressed the 88 uprising, again violently. I argued that it didn't go away. The desire for democracy didn't go away. Democracy was still on the minds of the people who still wanted it. And in 2007, an uprising occurs again. This time, it's led by these guys, the guys in the saffron robes. The monks decided to, and nuns too, it wasn't just monks, decided to lead the protest, and hundreds of millions of people, once again, in 2007, came out to try to promote change to democracy. Wow. Think about this for a second. Think about this for a second. We're talking 1962 to 2007. There's a lot of generations of people who are saying, and they're all overlapping one another. Their families, their brothers, fathers, grandparents, and all sort of things, all know each other, who are rising, who are going out into the streets to protest and to seek a revolution in their country, to move them to a democracy. It's just astounding to me, isn't it? It's just, as an American, it's like, wow, look what I have. I have this, you know. I want to hold on to my democracy and like say, look at what we, and then at the same time, I want to to shovel a little bit of it over to them a little bit and say, hey, because that's what they want, isn't it? Saffron Revolution was also violently repressed. But I think that all of these episodes, that's 3 so far, these episodes pushed Myanmar toward 2012, 2013. In 2012, the military starts to say, this isn't working very good. This isn't working very well. The military starts to listen to pressure from the Brits and from the United States, and it starts to crack. There starts to be little open movements. They start to move open, allow the press to have a little more freedom. They start to allow teaching to be a little more common. Let me give you a footnote here. Is that clock correct up there? Do we know if that one's correct?
It's 5 minutes fast.
Okay, good.
Yeah, it's 5 minutes.
All right, good. I just want to make sure that I'm not going to keep you guys till, because this is a subject that I could talk about for months. Okay. So where was I? Yes, thank you. Thank you, Dad. I interrupted myself here, didn't I? So, 2012, 2013, there's this crack, and in the military itself, they start to say, and they start to allow press to be free. They start to allow teaching. Oh, this is what I was going to tell you. There we go. They even allowed political scientists back in the country. Think about that for a second. That's odd, isn't it? It's odd that they feared guys like me so much that they didn't allow them to teach anymore. In 1962, when Ne Win took over, he sent all the foreign professors out of the country. No foreign professors at all. And they closed down history and political science departments. No history, no political science taught. Still no departments there. They call themselves International Relations Department, but they still do. They still teach. So 2012, 2013, they begin to allow. So in 1962, there were 2 American political scientists there. 2 of them in 1962. Between 1962 and me, in 2015, there were no American political scientists. I know, isn't that interesting? So we got to go back in, and I got to talk to them, and I got to stand in front of them and say, and talk to them about democracy. And they knew more about it than I did, because they had been fighting for it. They've been fighting for democracy this whole time. So the military starts to crack, things start to change. So in 2015, you got a major, huge election. Everybody turns out. It was an election like I've never seen before. It was like a Sunday service. It was a reverence about voting. Everybody, the country closed down, shops closed down, everybody went home, everybody voted. I want you to think about that for a second. Think about that for a second. The beauty of that, the idea of that. Think about that for like Tyler. If the reverence of the voting, the reverence of choosing your leaders, your past, your future, your policies, your ideas. That's the feeling that the Myanmar people had, and they had been fighting for their entire lives, and generations of their families have been fighting for. They got to vote. And they elected this woman and her party. The military, in 2008, wrote this really interesting constitution that gave the military a quarter of all parliament seats. Those are always military. And it also gave them power over all the administrative agencies of the government. So they really, there was an election in 2015, but the military still had power. All the real power, underlying stuff, was still being held by the military. But the Myanmar people saw hope for the first time. They saw an election. And they tasted it. They tasted freedom. They tasted, like, the open books thing. They got to read stuff. They got to experience the world. The internet flooded in. Phones became ubiquitous. Everything started to change for them. Probably more than what the military expected. Boy, the taste of that freedom, had tasted that liberty, of the idea, the taste of that was joyful and it was reverent. My students made videos about how they felt about it. Can you imagine an American student making a video how they felt about voting? That's how it was for them. It was a really emotional charge. Now we're going in the right direction. The man on the left there is now in charge of the country again. Here is a picture from he and Aung San Suu Kyi in 2015.
Can you say his name?
You know, it's Aung is this part. Myung Lang, I think the H is silent. I'm looking at it, but I think it's mine. He was trained in military institutions in this Myanmar king notion. And the military is trained differently, and their schooling is different than everybody else in the country. And so the mindset, the idea of how they see the world and how they see government is different from how everybody else sees it in their country. Just about everybody else. Did you have a question? I guess.
Is there military, mainly army? Do they have an air force?
They do. It's really small.
So it's mainly army.
It's army guys. It's a lot of army. It's heavy army. But it's also, it's interesting, the Chinese just gave them a submarine, for example, like 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago. So they have, Yangon is pretty close to the water, and so they have an access to water and stuff there. But, I mean, I don't know what their navy could be like. It's probably got one boat, one submarine that the Chinese gave them, I'm guessing. It's a country of 54 million people. So, it would fit in one Chinese city. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but not much. A little bit, not much. The relationship between these two was always tense. He thought he needed her. He thought she was democracy. And he thought that she was the key to his continued rule over time. I think, and I don't know this for certain, I hadn't had to interview her, and I would like to. Hopefully I will get to someday. Once she's out of power so she can talk. I think she never had power. I think she was labeled state counselor. She wasn't allowed to be president because of the 2008 Constitution. But she was figuratively in charge. And I think that really looked good for Myanmar. You put this person who's a democratic icon on the world stage, and you do things to the Rohingya people that you do, and it makes it look like your saint, your democratic icon, and that's the way that the world had taken Aung San Suu Kyi for a while. They really put her on a pedestal. And you put her out there in front, and you say, this is what we're doing. This is who we are. But you're not really that, because what you're really doing is you're running 700,000 people off from Rakhine State into Bangladesh. All the Rohingya Muslims are being killed or pushed into Bangladesh. Okay. The man on the left, on the line, says in 2018, okay, we'll have another election. We'll do one more election. So have another election. And the election turns out in 2020. Let's see if I've got it. No, yeah, I did. So the election in 2020 is an even bigger turnout.
Even with COVID.
Even with COVID. Yes, good point. This is a huge, sweeping change for democracy. The military is not at all in the running in it this time. It's a complete landslide for the National League for Democracy. I mean, in every office, not just at the top, but all parliament, all local positions, everyone in Myanmar saying democracy. Wow, big change. Military's like, what's going on? There's real power with those guys. And they want to keep their particular, what do you call it, a bird's nest on the ground? They want to keep their particular economic system that's in place there, in place. And so they see this change, this democratic change, as a real threat to their continued rule. Now the people are really, like in 2015 and 2020, it's not like they just protested in the streets and they went back home. They now know, and they're now participating, and everyone is engaged and involved in all this. So the military decides in March of last year to take over again. They arrest Aung San Suu Kyi. They charge you with having walkie-talkies. I'm not making that up. Walkie-talkies. I mean, at least they could have come up with something a little, that is just, walkie-talkies and COVID violations, I think, were the things that they arrested her for. But anyway, she's under house arrest again. And the women of Myanmar started something that the French women did in the 1700s. You guys know this about them? Yeah. They started banging pots and pans. I didn't realize that this was a French thing until recently. I leave it to the French women to bang saucepans, right? but that's what the Myanmar women started doing. They would go out into their balconies at night and bang pots and pans. This is a picture of one of them. This picture was spread all over the world because of the anguish in her face. They understood what happened. They knew to pretend like they didn't is like denigrating and disrespectful. They understood this was a military takeover. They understood that they wanted democracy. And so from February, March of 20 to today, we have had the military violently repressing the fourth episode of the promotion of democracy. This is the fourth one. Started in 1974, 1988, 2007, 2022, 21, 22. You guys know these pictures? I wanted to see if you knew these pictures. There's outfits up here. Do you know Angel? Somebody seen this? Have you seen it? Yeah. This child here, she's, I think, what is she, 17, 18, 19, 17, 18, 19, I can't remember her exact age. You can Google her name. This child represents Gen Z. So Generation Z is now taking to the streets for democracy. And Gen Z says they will not be denied. Senator McCain went to Myanmar in 2011, and he told the Myanmar military, once the people have the taste of freedom, it will not be denied. You may repress it, he told them. He told them this to their face. This is really very proud of Senator McCain. You may repress it, but they will get it at some point. Gen Z thinks they will get it. Angel was shot, she was killed. I'm sorry. Yes, she was shot. Yeah. Will they? It's a complicated situation. These three guys weigh in on it. Oh, do they weigh in on it? They're occupied in another place right today, aren't they? They're doing other things today, but they're all concerned about what's going on in Myanmar. Oddly enough. And this is the reason, or big part of the reason. Oil and gas. You see where that oil and gas lines run out? They run out to the Bay of Bengal there. They run across Myanmar. And you see all those little red soldiers? Now the People's Defense Armies of Myanmar are trying to attack the pipelines in different places. Now they've got them all. They've got troops all along the edges of the southern. That's running of power to a really power-hungry China. And if you know anything about China, they need power right now. The Chinese government needs that.
You don't need energy power, you need...
Yeah, well, both. This is energy. This is feeding their factories and their cars and their economic growth. There's the pipelines. They're massive. These countries are all, interestingly enough, have been snubbing the military. ASEAN has not been kind to the Myanmar military. They haven't been kind to them recently. Now, in the last few days, they've asked for meetings with the National Unity Government, which is the National League for Democracy movement folks. So the ASEAN group, these countries around this particular area. By the way, if you haven't been to this part of the world, go. You'll just won't want to come home. Okay, so this group is roundly, not completely, but they're snubbing the military, and that leads to some really interesting questions. We could have gone in that direction about the recognition of statehood and all that sort of things, which are all really good questions to think about. But that's ASEAN. President Biden hit the Myanmar military really hard. Right after the coup, they locked down billions of dollars in their bank accounts in the United States. So they hit them pretty hard. It's the United States, pro-democracy, China, Russia balancing the other and going in the other direction. I don't really think China cares. To be honest with you about it, I don't really think China cares what happens to the government in Myanmar. I think they just care about stability. As a matter of fact, I think that they'll negotiate with the National League for Democracy and the new national unity government, if that means they can keep their oil and gas coming. I don't think they care what the system of government is there. I really don't. Putin is another thing. Putin's on the other side. Putin cares about the authoritarian type of regime. And he supports the authoritarian, obviously, for obvious reasons, the authoritarian regime. Okay, that's government. So think about that question from the beginning. What was the question I asked you? How should you be governed? The Myanmar people clearly want to be governed by democracy, don't they? There's no doubt about that in my mind. Yes, good point. So do the people of Ukraine. Is that the best form of government? Is Churchill right about that? I think so. I'm biased, though. I have a real bias in that way.
I'm biased too.
Tell me.
But I want a constitutional republic.
Okay, and what do you mean by that? What do you mean by that?
That the Constitution of the United States is supposed to be the supreme law of the land.
Okay.
Article 5, paragraph 2 and 3. That Constitution makes us different than any other country in the world.
In what way?
It gives us more freedom.
Okay.
If it's followed. I took an oath to defend and protect the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic.
Thank you for your service.
But right now, those people who take the oath are violating their own oath.
Oh, I see. Okay. So, but what you're talking about, and what it seems to me like you're supporting, is this idea of a rule of law, maybe. Are you saying that there needs to be like a situation where you have a constitution, a basic constitution, and then we're all going to respect that constitution? Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Yeah, isn't that remarkable? And you have a rule of law, what that means? Yes. Judges make decisions, the legislature makes their
The
decisions.
Constitution gives us the freedom
Yeah.
we have.
Yeah.
It doesn't bind us. But
Exactly.
it's supposed to bind the politicians.
Absolutely.
Instead, but there's I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
Not since World War II, the Constitution says Congress shall declare war. World
Right.
War II was the last war the Congress.
41, right?
We've had all these other wars, including those I've been involved in.
Yeah.
Were illegal.
Yeah.
According to the Constitution.
Absolutely. We need to file suit, Mayor. I think somebody's done that already. Somebody's done that already, haven't they? They filed suit for that reason. Yes, ma'am.
Kind of the same idea, but when you have a country going way back, which was dependent on kings for generations, and then they are exposed to constitutional monarchy, why don't they move in that direction? So they would still be able to have a king, but move in the way of some sort of democracy. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it does. And I'll tell you what the answer to that is. There's a state within the state in Myanmar. The state within the state is that there are about, depends on how you ask define it, there are about 200,000 to 500,000 people who are directly benefiting from the economic situation that exists there now. So let me say that again slowly. There are about roughly 500,000 people within 54 million who are directly benefiting from the military being in charge. Okay, so that group in the military, the elite military guys, are directly benefiting from an economic structure and a governing structure that represses everybody else. They don't want to change that. And that's what the battle is about now. The battle is about whether you have a small cadre of elite people who are in charge and reaping the benefits of everything, from jade to oil and gas. That small group of people is there. And they like the current system. And so do the elite military, who have houses in Ohio, I'm not exaggerating, and in Tokyo, and places in Europe. And so those guys are all living in that, off of that figure, and they want to maintain that. There's no reason for them to change, to move in any other direction, unless the Myanmar people can force them to move. Does that make sense? They're not interested in change. Somebody else had a question? Yes?
Okay, so you mentioned the Rohingya, and one thing is in Myanmar, there are plenty of different groups who do not consider themselves Myanmar ethnically, and I was wondering if you could talk about some of the other ethnic minorities and the insurgencies they've been fighting for a very long time.
Yeah. So essentially, if you look at the map of Myanmar, you'll see that it's quite, there are 364 different ethnic groups labeled there. It's interesting that they're labeled that way, first of all. It's actually a British administrative label. The Brits. I actually drew circles around these, and they didn't think about themselves as different too much. The people didn't think about themselves until the Brits drew circles around them. So the Brits actually kind of created, and they did this in other places around the world too. The Brits have done this elsewhere. So they begin to think about themselves differently. If you look in different places, there are different, they're not all Buddhists, for example. In Rakhine State over on the left, there's a really large group of roughly 3 million or so Muslims live in that part of the country, and that's been shrinking because of the military, for obvious reasons. You see Naypyidaw in the middle there. The Shan people are largely Buddhist. Kachin up in the top up there are almost all Christians. This is a really weird little story for you. There was a Northern Baptist preacher named Judson. You guys know this guy? You guys know this man? In the 1820s, right when the British first got there, he decided to go and save some souls and went to Kachin State. And he converted tens of thousands of people to being Baptist. And so now there are Baptist churches all over that part of the country and in Yangon. There are Baptist churches all over the place. This is an amazing feat.
Is there any tribal loyalties?
Oh yeah, yeah. It's interesting you ask that. Right now, the Myanmar people are more interested in coming. They call themselves the National Unity Government, and unifying against the military. Even if they were at one time separate, like the Wa people are different, or separate from, or the Chen are separate. The Chen are largely Christian as well. The Chen are separate from, and they would think about themselves in kind of a different kind of way. But today, because of the military, there's a lot of people, especially a lot of young people who will put their arms around their Muslim brothers and sisters there and say, we're all part of this together now, which is an interesting offshoot of a repressive military regime. Yes, Dr. Cream, there are a number, 360 some odd different groups, and some of them are even broken off into their own little enclaves of control. Some of the groups, the Wa people, for example, up in that area, up in the top there, close on the Chinese border, have complete control of the country, have complete control of their area.
Do they have their own army?
Their own army, their own standing army. There are several standing armies in these groups around in the outlying areas, which begs the question about statehood and control, which I think which I thought about by taking this lecture in that direction, because it's a good question about the country itself. But I'll get to your questions. What else is on your mind?
Buddhism still predominates.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And it's about peacefulness, tranquility, and they recruit from Buddhist men to go into the military, right? So do they indoctrinate them totally to set aside their religion and just focus on what they're told to do?
That's a really good question. It's a really good question. Buddhism is rated, statistics show that it's about 80% of the population of Myanmar are Buddhist. The men that are in the military kind of fall in two different camps. You've got a rank and file group it's a job, and it's something that they're being paid to do. And they're all Buddhist, or not all, but almost all Buddhist. The top people, military and the elites, the officers and the elites, are all exclusively Buddhist. They won't allow any other religion, anybody to practice another religion in the top ranks. So no Christians, no Muslims, no Hindus in the top ranks at all. And that's the same case in civil service as well. That's the same thing there as well. How they get around this notion of using a peaceful religion as a tool of war is it's a corruption of the idea of Buddhism. So they've corrupted the idea of what it means to be Buddhist. And that's not uncommon though. If you think about it around the world, it's not uncommon to see people corrupt a religion in order to make it rationalize something else. And we do the same thing, and humans do this all over the world, whatever religion you're talking about. And Buddhism itself can be just as violent as any other religion.
And is it the power and the money that corrupt?
Yeah, I think it's more the economic structure of that situation that's corrupting. Now, corrupting the religion, I think that's a church-state relationship there that's corrupted the religion, and I think that's happened over the last 1,000 years. And so it's been a long time corruption. Now there's a very close relationship in Myanmar between the government and the religion, and the state has been supporting religion from 1057 on.
Do you know how they became Muslims, how they became Muslims?
The Muslims in Myanmar?
Yeah, how did they become Muslims?
That's a really good question, and it's probably one that we need to discuss at another point. But I asked my students this question last night. Actually, is there a decision that a person makes about their religion? And I'll leave that for you, and we can talk about it afterwards. Somebody else have their hand up.
Well, I was thinking about the economy of the country. What's the average? We think of that being very poor and the average person not having much.
Right.
But is that still the case? And
Yes. Yeah, there's a really major divide between haves and have-nots. Income inequality there is worse than it is here in other parts of the world. And it's worse because of the economic structure that they put in place, the governing structure that they put in place. So you've got a very small group of people, 500,000 or so, 200,000 or so, who are directly benefiting from the structure of the system, and everybody else is just working for it and existing and barely living there. And so like a teacher at one of the universities where I was working might make $300 a month. And so, it's really very small, very, very, very meager existence for most of the Myanmar people. I would say 90% of them are living in a really, really, really poor level. In my neighborhood where I lived in Yangon, I would walk out of my apartment and there was huts there where people were sleeping on cardboard or on boards. This was just a common way of life for them. It wasn't uncommon. It wasn't like I was seeing some homeless people. This was just their life. And so yeah, it's a life-changing type of poverty when you see it. Does that make sense? Do you understand what I'm trying to say? I came back a completely different person after seeing that people can live in that particular way. Good question. Thank you for asking. It's hard.
Those who graduate from college there get into the government.
Yeah.
And they become part of the upper class. There's no real middle class like teachers and professors.
Yeah, it's really interesting you asked that question. The students that I taught at Yangon University were largely the students of the elite, and they had actually studied in the United States or in Korea or in Japan, and they actually had English as their second language, that sort of thing. So yes, sir.
Would you make a few comments to us in their language?
No, I can't. It's a good question, and I can say like Minglaba and stuff like that, but the reason I have trouble with this is because I'm a box of rocks Westerner with I say dumb as a box of rocks. I say that because it's a tonal language, it's like Chinese, and that I'm like deaf to it. So one word, I don't know if you know this about Chinese, for example, the word ma in Chinese, and the way I just said it could say 3 or 4 different things. Do you follow what I'm saying? So no, I don't know. I don't know Burmese. I don't know it. I wish I did. And I lived there for long enough where you'd think I could have absorbed some of it, but no. The beautiful thing about, or the bad thing about knowing English is that wherever you go in the world, people will speak to you in it. You know, even in Myanmar. Because the Brits were there for so long, it's a second language for folks there. Thank you for asking that.
Do we have many students from there in the United States?
No. And it's funny, I got a message just this morning from one of them asking me if I could help him find a way to get here. It's really hard for them to get into the country. It's really hard. It's really hard because of money, particularly. It's difficult for them. I've got a former student who walked out of Myanmar. She led protest early on. And so she was photographed leading protests. And so she went into hiding. And she walked to Thailand. And then she made her way into Korea. She's in Korea now. She's trying to get to the United States. And we're having trouble getting her here. She can
come to the southern border to get across.
I'm sorry?
She can come to our southern border to get across.
Yeah. I'm talking about a real person, brother.
A picture of Biden and Xi. What do we know? You said China's not interested. We know that's probably not true.
I mean, China's not interested in the type of form of government, is what I'm trying to say. I don't think they care whether it's a democracy. They probably don't care too much about that. They care about stability.
What about colonization? They're interested in that.
They are certainly doing that. That One Belt, One Road initiative is certainly that. And I would actually argue that there's economic colonization already occurring between the Chinese and Myanmar. And the rest of Southeast Asia, too, by the way. When I was there, it was not at all uncommon to share the cab with Chinese businessmen leaving from the airport, because they were every day there, building something, extracting something, putting up a shopping mall, that sort of thing. There's 54 million people there ripe for it, and there's no way at all that the Chinese government's not going to invite that sort of thing.
We talk about in democracy having an educated electorate. What kind of education does the majority?
I like the question. I love this question. And I want you to think about that. I'm glad you did it. So, there's this notion that started in the 1960s at Harvard that some people were prepared for democracy and some people weren't. Some people were ready for it because they're intelligent, they're educated, and they're ready for it. And the other people they're like goats and they have to be shirked or run around, they're not ready for it. The Myanmar people, a lot of them have not had education because there hasn't been the opportunity for them to have it. I've had students who lived through this time where the universities were closed down, completely closed down. And they know what a democracy is. They know where power is lying, even though they haven't had formal education. Does that answer your question?
Sort of.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm not sure there's another answer.
Yeah, it really bothers me. It's one of those things, the military and a lot of elites around the world say, oh, those poor people, they just don't know what they want. They don't know yet. Because they're too stupid to know. They don't know, they're not educated. That's just not the case.
Well, there's a difference between formal education, which is what we generally mean when we say education, and smart people who can learn without books.
Sure, that's a good point. That's a good point. That's fair. Yes, ma'am.
Is there a free public education system?
It's Buddhist. It's Buddhist. It's been done for the last 50 years or so. It's been done, and before that even, monasteries were responsible for that, for the education process.
The monks were all the teachers?
Yes, the monks were the teachers, which is really an interesting sub-problem as well. The British tried to change that and put into place a more common public institution, and there's a competing institutions, but by and large it's still monk-based. Yeah, Jay.
Yes. Right now, I think they have, from what I've heard, about 12.5% of the global production for, and more than half of China's domestic supplies
Of what? We're talking-
of oil and gas.
Oh, was that right?
Sure.
I didn't know those numbers, but it doesn't surprise me.
And where do you see them going in the future?
Myanmar?
Yes.
I want to say that it's not sustainable, that the situation, the economic and the governance situation that they have is not sustainable. But at the same time, I look back and I just told you a story that's been from 1962 to the present. That's pretty sustainable for some people. You know, the Chinese, they don't care. I don't think they care. I don't think they care as long as it's stable and we continue to pump that stuff out of there for them. So where I see it going, I'm hopeful, but I'm not real optimistic. I'm hopeful. My heart's there, my friends and colleagues are there, and they'll watch me say this. And I want for them freedom. I want for them to have a share of the profits of that. But I'm not certain that they're going to get it anytime soon. Does that answer your question?
I was thinking more, would they be leaning more towards the West?
Oh, well, that's what the Biden administration has been thinking about, and that's what ASEAN is thinking about. Who's gonna get that oil? Is that gonna come to us, or is it gonna go to them, or
I don't see us taken away from China.
No, I don't either. The Chinese built that pipeline.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't see it either. Yeah, and that's the whole relation, the whole Southeast Asia thing. The balance of power there is a whole other question that the United States has been interested in for quite some time.
Because that's the only thing they're exporting, right?
Yeah, jade, other little things, but yes, you're right. Oil and gas are their thing,
Yeah.
which is a pretty good thing in this world economy. Somebody else can do that.
I was just wondering, on the alliance of Southeast Asia, and what kind of activity is there among those nations? Any?
Yeah, that's a pretty strong alliance. It's like a lot of things where you get, like the United Nations, when you get a bunch of nations together, it's difficult to get a good answer out of them. Those international government organizations have trouble deciding what's the best path going forward. And some lean towards the military and economic, and others not. Cambodia, for example, is an authoritarian regime now, with kind of those draconian types of ways of interacting with its people, and they're siding with the military. So ASEAN has taken and snubbed the military 2 or 3 times in major ways. So they've taken somewhat of a stance. It hasn't been real strong, very strong stances, so to speak. How are we doing on time?
Last question.
Okay.
Question?
Yeah,
All right, Jay, you ask me a question.
okay.
Jay and I visit all the time, so you can ask a
When you
question.
said 12.5% of oil and gas, does that mean the total flowing from China?
You know, I don't know those numbers. I don't keep up with those kinds of
But you said that number. Okay, the main thing is, okay, who is the most successful country out of the Asian group? And how democratic is good old Vietnam?
Well, depends on what you mean by successful.
Politically, economically?
What do you mean? Yeah, those are really good questions. Judge, thank you.
I'm not waiting.
Oh,
Not waiting.
all right. JD, that's a good question. Successful in that particular region. Let's look at it. Oops. Singapore? Oh man, if you go to Singapore. It's like London but clean. Yes. And I mean, Singapore's got some really strange things going on. But yeah, I think maybe Vietnam. Gosh, go to Vietnam, you're going to be blown away. Entrepreneurs that you can't believe, energy like you can't believe. Beautiful place. Thailand, poor. Laos, you know. I've been in Indonesia recently. Jakarta is beautiful, big metropolitan, but I wouldn't say anything compares to Singapore. I would say Singapore probably in the region. Yeah.
And you're thinking of it as a democratic
Yeah.
society? Because the Philippines now have an autocrat.
Yes.
Did, was it Thailand, just, the king is now gone, are they
Yeah.
ready for democracy?
Yeah.
Cambodia, what's its status as far as
You know, they
government freedom?
authoritarian, and they recently put in I don't know how to describe this exactly, but a pipe essentially to control the entire internet through everything. It comes to the government is controlling everything that comes in and out of the country in Cambodia. So that tells you a little bit about their point. Yes.
Okay, yes, so.
We could do this all day, couldn't we?
We could really literally do this all day, but yes, we're 15 minutes over, so big round of applause for Professor Durkin.